In your research, you talk about how these themes, the role of institutions and systems and what they do in terms of racial inequality, and then how that shows up in terms of economic inequality. And you draw a pretty straight line between the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and economic progress in Black communities. How did this act that was focused on voting end up playing into the economics of Black communities?
Yeah, I think voting is critical, and I think many people feel the same way. Uh, Again, as I mentioned, I think progress is made, is fought and won in the margins, and I think the Voting Rights Act is a clear example of this. You have a regulation, a piece of legislation that once it was enacted, it increased the ability of Blacks to vote. And what my co-author Abe and I are showing is that that directly had an effect on the public hiring of voters. That's one of the things that happens. So once you start hiring more workers on the public sector, it makes it harder for the private sector to actually discriminate. So you start seeing that the hiring of in the private sector becomes better. There's higher wages for Blacks, and that starts reducing the inequality in the private sector between Blacks and whites. Not only that is happening, like by having better voting protections, you're also giving teeth to other regulations that you have in place. You have the Civil Rights Act enacted just 1 year prior to the Voting Rights Act. And you start seeing that the enforcement becomes better. You start also seeing that politicians, even the same politicians that were there before the enactment of the Voting Rights Act, start voting more consistently with civil rights regulation. They are support civil rights regulation better. So just by having more power to vote, you're affecting the inequality that you had in place. Even if the vote doesn't have to take place, you're just changing. You're changing the objective function of the politician. And I don't think this applies only to politicians. I think this applies to all governance system. There's a key difference, I would say, from what happened in 1965 and what is happening right now. I think something that's happening right now is that a lot of the politics that we are seeing are focusing on changing the rules. In changing the rules again, who can vote and who cannot, instead of trying to address or try to convince the people that can vote. And I think that may make it a little bit more difficult going forward to both have better protections for voting, but also to reduce inequality.
You actually quantified how much of a monetary difference in terms of wages there was for people after the Voting Rights Act. Can you give us some of those numbers?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Our preferred estimate for Bavaria is like 5.5% in wages. This is quite large in effect. You can think about this correcting about 20% of the wage gap between Blacks and whites. So this is a meaningful difference. And this spillovers into many other things, like having more like wages will improve your well-being along many other dimensions.